On October 4th, 1582, you went to sleep in October and woke up on October 15th. 10 days were removed by papal decree to correct the Julian calendar's drift, a legitimate fix to a real mathematical problem. But the reform also preserved the 12-month structure, when a simpler, more mathematically coherent alternative was being actively proposed by calendar reformers. 13 months of 28 days each, perfectly aligned to the lunar cycle. The 13-month system has been periodically proposed, analyzed, and found superior ever since. It has never been adopted, not once. The resistance is too consistent to be coincidence. October 4th, 1582. You go to sleep on a Thursday in October. You wake up on a Friday, October 15th, 1582. 10 days have vanished from the calendar by decree of the papal authority that introduced the Gregorian reform. The official explanation is that the Julian calendar, which had been in use throughout Europe since Julius Caesar's reform of 46 BCE, had accumulated a small error, approximately 11 minutes per year. That over the 15-odd centuries of the Julian calendar's operation had produced a drift of about 10 days between the calendar date of the spring equinox and the astronomical event itself. The spring equinox was occurring on March 11th, rather than March 21st. The calculation of Easter, which is defined in relationship to the spring equinox, was therefore producing an incorrect date. 10 days were cut from October 1582 to reset the calendar, and new leap year rules were introduced to prevent the drift from accumulating again. This explanation is accurate. The Julian calendar did have an 11-minute error. The equinox had drifted. The Gregorian reform did correct the drift and institute better leap year rules. All of this is true. None of it explains why the reform left the fundamental structure of the 12-month year intact, when a simpler and more mathematically coherent alternative was available and was being advocated for by calendar reformers throughout the medieval and early modern periods. The 13-month alternative was not a fringe proposal. It was the subject of serious, scholarly, and administrative discussion at multiple points in the centuries preceding the Gregorian reform. The mathematical elegance of 13 months of 28 days each, plus one transitional day, producing a perfect year of 365 days in which every month begins on the same day of the week. Every quarter has the same number of days, and the weeks divide evenly into months, was understood and appreciated by the same scholars who were debating calendar reform throughout this period. The 13-month reform would have solved not just the equinox drift problem, but the entire arithmetic incoherence of the 12-month system. It would have produced a calendar that was simpler, more regular, and more practically useful than either the Julian or the Gregorian system. It was not adopted, not in 1582, not in any of the subsequent reform discussions that have continued periodically since then. Most recently, the World Calendar Proposal of the early 20th century and the International Fixed Calendar Proposal that Eastman Kodak and several other large corporations actually adopted for internal use in the 1920s. The 13-month alternative has been periodically proposed, periodically analyzed, periodically found to be mathematically superior to the existing system, and then not adopted, each time for slightly different stated reasons, but always with the same practical result. The 12-month system persists. Why? The official reasons given for the rejection of the 13-month proposal are worth examining. The most common objection is religious. The 13-month system doesn't accommodate the traditional 7-day week cycle in a way that preserves existing religious holy day traditions. This is true, but it is an objection that applies to any calendar reform. since any significant restructuring of the calendar will disrupt the relationship between the reformed calendar's structure and the traditional religious observance schedule. The Gregorian reform itself disrupted existing dates. The question is not whether disruption occurs, but whether the disruption is worth the benefit. For the Gregorian reform, a 10-day correction was deemed worth the disruption it caused. For the 13-month reform, a mathematically coherent calendar was not worth the disruption of existing traditions. This asymmetry, the ease of adopting a reform that corrects an existing calendar's error while preserving its fundamental structure, versus the resistance to adopting a reform that replaces the fundamental structure with a more coherent one, is precisely what I want to examine. Because the resistance to the 13-month proposal is not just institutional inertia, it has a consistent character across 5 centuries of discussion. The resistance specifically prioritizes the preservation of the 12-month structure, the irregular months, the non-divisible year, as if the specific incoherences of the 12-month system are features rather than bugs, as if the calendar's mathematical awkwardness is a design flaw rather than a regrettable legacy of historical accident. What would it mean if the Gregorian calendar's mathematical incoherence was a design goal? If the 12 irregular months, the non-divisible year, the week cycle that doesn't align with the month structure, were deliberately preserved because they serve a function that a coherent calendar would not serve? The function I keep arriving at is disorientation, dependency. The condition in which the population cannot calculate the date without reference to an external authority, cannot determine where they are in the year without checking a calendar, cannot organize their agricultural, or commercial, or ceremonial activities by simple arithmetic, because the calendar's arithmetic doesn't work. This sounds conspiratorial. I know it sounds conspiratorial, but let me give you the specific contrast. In the 13-month calendar, any child can calculate any date in the year by knowing the month number and the day number. Month 7, day 14, means the same day of the week every year, because every month starts on the same day of the week. The calendar is learnable, internalizable, self-sufficient. You can carry it in your head. In the Gregorian calendar, you need to know that September has 30 days, and October has 31 days, and February has 28, except when it has 29. And you need a table, or a mnemonic, or an app to tell you what day of the week March 14th falls on in any given year. The calendar is externally dependent. You need the printed calendar, the digital device, the institutional reference point. You cannot orient yourself in the Gregorian year without tools the institution provides. And the 13-month calendar, with its perfect alignment to the lunar cycle and its 28-day months that mirror the actual observed lunar period, keeps the population in synchrony with something that no institution controls. The moon. The actual visible moon, whose cycle runs at 29.5 days, whose phases are visible to the naked eye, whose influence on tidal patterns and biological rhythms is documentable and real. A population that orients its time by the moon is a population that has access to a timing reference the administrative system cannot manipulate. The moon cannot be declared illegal. The moon cannot be reformed by papal decree. The moon runs on its own schedule, which has nothing to do with the administrative convenience of any governing authority, and which the 13-month calendar keeps the population synchronized with. The Gregorian calendar breaks that synchrony. Its 12 irregular months create a calendar that runs parallel to the lunar cycle without aligning with it. That produces a systematic drift between calendar months and actual moon phases that makes the moon an astronomical curiosity rather than a calendrical reference point. A person keeping time by the Gregorian calendar, and a person keeping time by the 13-month lunar calendar are living in different temporal frameworks. The Gregorian person has their time organized by the institution. The 13-month person has their time organized by the sky. The Gregorian reform, by preserving the 12-month structure while correcting the equinox drift, made a specific choice, the institutional frame, over the natural one. The choice was made in 1582 by a pope whose immediate concern was the calculation of Easter. His successor's concern, across 5 centuries of resistance to the 13-month proposal, has been the preservation of a temporal framework that keeps populations dependent on institutionally provided reference points for their orientation in the year. The missing month is not missing by accident. It was left out deliberately, preserved in its absence by every subsequent resistance to calendar reform, because a calendar with 13 months would give people access to a temporal reference the institution doesn't control. And a population with access to temporal references the institution doesn't control is a population that is harder to schedule, harder to synchronize, harder to manage in the ways that the post-reset administrative order has always required. The month is recoverable. The lunar cycle is still running at its actual frequency, indifferent to the Gregorian calendar's preference for 12. Every full moon is still a 29th or 30th night. The 13 count is still written in the sky every year in the actual number of full moons that occur between one spring and the next. The calendar that was designed to sever your relationship with that count is the calendar on your wall and on your phone. But the count is still running in the sky without asking permission. If the Gregorian calendar's specific incoherences, the irregular months, the non-divisible year, the week cycle that doesn't align with the months, are features rather than bugs, serving to keep the population dependent on institutionally provided time references rather than the observable sky. Who benefits from a calendar you can't carry in your head? Tell us what you think in the comments, and share this with someone who has never questioned why the months aren't equal.